Everybody, and welcome. Very pleased to uh, host this session today. Um, it's really quite an interesting area for all of us to be very much aware of what's going on in this field. Rethinking income and money does actually feel very close to home for so much of us. So, Geoff has been working in this field for a long time. I feel he's got a huge background in economics theory and thinking, and has been particularly focused on this area for the last 15 years or so. So, Geoff, I would like to hand over to you and let you introduce yourself and get going and say thank you very much for doing this. It's great.
No, well, thank you very much, Shane, and the rest of you for the invitation to join you today and to present these ideas. And I would emphasize that they are developmental ideas and hypotheses, so I'm not claiming to be right about it all. I'm flying some kites, and I'm perfectly happy for you to come back and challenge those kites. But I do think that there needs to be some fundamental rethinking of the current structure of modern economies. And at the end, I'll be as quick as I can with my presentation. But at the end, I'd really like to see it as a discussion and debate, not necessarily a question and answer, because I don't claim to have the answers to every question. So I don't have guru status at all. So I'll now try to share my screen. Window, screen, share. And I hope you can all see that. Can you, is that, security alert, okay. Is that visible to everyone?
That's fine, Geoff. Yeah.
Okay.
You're still in presentation mode, but that's
Okay, so off we go then. So this is presenting my recent book called Rethinking Income and Money and Incorporating Technology into Economic Theory. So there's the little graphic of the book in the top right-hand corner. It's easily available from Palgrave, the publisher. For some reason, whilst it's available on Amazon, they're quoting 4 or 5 month delivery, which I have talked to them about. I don't understand, but there it is. But it's readily available from the Palgrave Pivot website, and therefore this is the Schumacher Institute webinar. So the main claims I make in the book are the following. First of all, I'm claiming that technology is responsible for reducing labor income in the economy in general, but particularly for the lowest quintile, the lowest 20% of household income earners. And that reduction in labor income is causing severe, long-lasting poverty in that income group. The next claim is that increased welfare income is a structural necessity in a modern economy, and we cannot rely just on work and wage policies as we have done for the last half a century. So the answer to poverty and low income from most political groups, whether they be left or right, is for high wage work to be created, which is great if you can do it, but is not reliable if you can't do it because the technology is moving in the opposite direction. And I'll try to show that that is in fact the case. The third claim is that affordability in an economy is defined by the real resources in that economy, the labor, the land, the materials, the technology, the inherited infrastructure, and not by the financial balances of the government. So here I pit Keynes against Rachel Reeves. Keynes, who in a 1942 BBC interview famously said, anything we can actually do, we can afford. So his definition of affordability was the ability to do something, whereas Rachel Reeves says that we can only do what we can afford. So the question is, who is your money on in that debate about the definition of affordability? The fourth, pardon?
yeah, we
Okay, I
can
think
see
we'll have to go through with this then.
the
Okay,
slide.
so these are the main claims. Number one, that technology reduces labor income, which I've just covered, particularly for lowest quintile income households. Secondly, that increased welfare income is therefore a structural necessity in advanced technology economies, and we can't rely on the hope that we can create high wage work because the technology is mitigating against that. Thirdly, that affordability is defined by real resources, not financial balances. So a minute ago, I quoted Keynes in his 1942 radio interview, who said that, quotes, anything we can actually do, we can afford. So affordability is defined by doability, whereas Rachel Reeves said last year, we can only do what we can afford, i.e. the other way around. The fourth point, and I will amplify these points later, the fourth point that I try to make is that money is not debt at the point of its creation. So this is a fundamental claim about the definition of money, if you like, the ontology of money. All money is created. It doesn't pre-exist in nature. And therefore, at the point of its creation, which is now almost totally digitally, at the point of its creation, it is not debt because it didn't exist the minute before it was created. It didn't belong to anybody else. Therefore, it's created and not borrowed. This is a very important point for points I'll make later. Then in quantitative easing, when the central bank purchased its own government debt, it turned it into not debt. So we ended up with a zero net debt position when the government's central bank bought its own government's debt in the secondary market during the QE exercise, which was big and went up to £875 billion. Then the QE is seriously faltered. And I will make the claim that direct money financing is superior to quantitative easing, and it also breaks the debt constraint, because the debt constraint, as we all know, is currently used to reduce government expenditure, including on welfare benefits. And we need to break that vicious circle. And finally, these are more theoretical points, but there is a core need to incorporate technology into economic theory, which I will present. And I also present a critique of contemporary mainstream orthodox economic theory. So I hopefully you can see this next slide.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so here is a demonstration from ONS data of the inadequacy of lower quintile incomes. So I'm tracing it back from 1977 to 2022, and I reference at the top right-hand the graphic there, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation on UK poverty, which they produce each year. But this is ONS data in constant prices, and showing in those five lines the 5 quintiles of income. And you can see that the bottom quintile income has hardly increased, while the top quintile income has increased very substantially. And that, of course, is pictured by this slide of labour income declining as a percentage of GDP. So this is for all OECD countries, showing over the last 50 years that the labour share of GDP has declined from just over 70% to just over 60%. So there is an inexorable secular decline in the percentage of GDP going as labour income and ending up as household income. And equality, again, as we all know, this is a commonplace observation, but of course a very serious one, is extremely high. So the top quintile of households are earning 43% of the national household disposable income, and the bottom quintile is earning only 7%. And in the book, I expand that much further and show that, for example, the top quintile are earning more from investment income than the lowest quintile is earning in wages. So inequality in both income and wealth is severe from the model, from the current paradigm. And at the same time, household debt is increasing. This is again for OECD countries running over a long period, 30 to 35 years, showing that household debt as a percentage of GDP has grown from 42% up to close to 70%. So we're seeing income getting eroded and debt increasing. Here are commonly placed explanatory hypotheses for these phenomenon. One is a personal explanation to do with the people involved, that they may lack the skill sets that the modern technological paradigm requires, and that therefore the solution is training and education. Or that actually it's to do with faultedness of some sort in the individual. It's to do with their disposition, their motivation, and their behavioral characteristics. So one of those is a slightly more respectful personal explanation, and the other one not. And the first tends to be the view of the left politically, that it's due to low skill sets, therefore training is the answer. And the unfortunate explanation from the right wing that's to do with people being shirkers. The political explanation is that rentier capitalism is forever redistributing towards the elite and is reducing trade unionization rates and labor bargaining power. The structural explanation, which I'm exploring, is that technology and automation are shifting the production function away from low-skill work, and that further automation via artificial intelligence will drive this effect up the income scale. So this, as I call it from my point of view, this preferred hypothesis argues for an inevitable increase in social welfare income, whereas in fact present government policy is threatening, as we know, a decrease in social welfare income. So on money, my postulates are as follows. So I've just covered my postulates on income. Sorry, do you want to say something? No? The postulates on income is, first of all, as I've already claimed, money is not debt at the point of its creation. And secondly, as I also mentioned, that central bank purchase of its own government debt is equivalent to net zero debt, or zero net debt, and equivalent to direct money financing. That happened immensely through QE and is not yet at all totally unwound. So the central bank still owns 660 billion of the UK government's debt. And since the central bank is owned by the government, my claim is that is zero net debt. So current monetary policy practice is as follows. It's commercial banks that create money, and they create that money whenever they make a loan to an individual or to a business, a commercial loan. And at that point of creating money, which they don't borrow from anybody else, the commercial banks gain the full seigniorage on that money. The seigniorage is the difference between the face value of the money they've created and the cost of creating it. Well, when we had coinage, of course, coinage costs you something to produce, and so does paper money. But now that 97% of money is digital, which costs nothing to produce as a marginal cost, the commercial banks are making a huge gain on the seigniorage of the money they create, as well as the interest they charge on the loans that they make with the money they've created. So the commercial banks create money into the system. The money then washes around the system. People spend it, transfer it, and so on. A lot of it ends up in the bank accounts of the pension funds and insurance companies. And the government, when it wants to make expenditure, has to borrow from those pension funds and insurance companies. So curiously, the system allows commercial banks to create money, but generally, apart from QE, does not let the central bank create money. So we get a situation where national debts rise to be greater than the GDP of the economy. And at that point, the debt is illusory because no economy can pay back more than its GDP. We also then see interest rates being lifted by the central bank to contain inflation, which then means, of course, that the debt financing cost for the government also gets increased. And they then feel obliged to apply austerity to the disadvantage of those who are already disadvantaged. So as the little icon shows there, this is a pretty grim result, and it's not a very sensible paradigm and practice that we're currently operating. So quantitative easing has significant dysfunctionalities. So as I say at the top there, it's the process whereby a central bank buys government debt, importantly in the secondary market from example, pension funds and insurance companies, as well as from stockbrokers, rich individuals, and actually from foreign central banks. But, and here are the big buts, the Bank of England is not allowed to purchase bonds in the primary debt management office auction of government debt. Only stockbrokers, rich individuals can go in and buy pension funds and insurance companies can go in and buy government debt in the primary auction. And if the Bank of England then wants to buy these bonds, it has to buy in the secondary market from those intermediaries, thus hugely enriching them at zero risk. And Francis Breeden at Queen Mary College has a paper out estimating that gain at £4 billion to the trading intermediaries. Secondly, the Bank of England in QE purchased long-term fixed interest bonds. The problem with that decision was that, firstly, when interest rates went up, the value of those bonds inevitably went down. And created huge losses in the value of the bonds if they were sold. And that loss is estimated to be in excess of £100 billion. Secondly, the Bank of England funded the purchase of these bonds from the pension funds and the insurance companies by simply creating money, creating reserves at the commercial banks to buy the bonds from the pension fund or the insurance company. But it chose, many of us would think foolishly, to pay variable rate interest on the money it itself had created and lodged with the central bank. So as interest rates rose, this meant the Bank of England was paying 5% on the money it had created with the central banks. But because the interest rate on the bond was only 2%, it was losing 3% of the value of the money it had created, estimated at about 20 billion a year. So all these losses are charged to public funds through the indemnity that the Treasury gives to the Bank of England. So the Bank of England loses money, it relies on the Treasury indemnity to fund that loss, and it therefore goes into government spending restrictions. Bad result. BOE can be criticised for failing to publish any risk testing of its QE strategy for discussion, even though they themselves create the interest rate changes which produce these losses. I think, and I make this point in the book, that this challenges the beloved policy of central bank independence. Why should any entity be sufficiently independent to wreak this havoc without accountability? So as a result, as we see in this graph, government debt rises inexorably and universally. So for all of the countries mapped there, compared to the position in, say, the early 70s, the position in the 21st century is of increasing debt exceeding GDP in many cases. And in the case of Japan, actually reaching 250% of GDP. So government debt is inexorably rising. Furthermore, this graph seems to me to show that government debt is rather arbitrary. So we see there Estonia and Luxembourg and Denmark with debt to GDP ratios down to 25%, 40%. And we see this classic case of Japan there with a debt ratio to GDP ratio of over 250%. And an OECD average of about 93%, I think it is. But it shows, I would suggest, a rather arbitrary result of the debt to GDP ratio. So although the Maastricht Treaty was supposed to restrict this to 60%, it's just been broken and left. So that's the phenomena, that's the data, that's the situation we face. So what kind of reforms in monetary policy are possible? I'm claiming there in the title that direct money financing is the best reform. Other reforms that are possible are negative interest rates, which Japan certainly did try and implemented, and which a paper which I refer in the book from the ECB staff unit demonstrates to be perfectly feasible. So negative interest rates may be one reform. Another reform may be that the central bank should not pay interest on the quantitative easing reserves that it created. That 5% that it's paying on these reserves it's created. An argument is that they shouldn't pay such interest, or at least they should tier the reserves and only pay interest on part of the reserves they've created. And the third reform is that you could allow the Bank of England, the central bank, or the ECB, whoever, Fed, to buy government debt directly from the government. But allowing the central bank to do that collapses to direct money financing, i.e. where the government and its own central bank simply create the money to fund the government's expenditure. So the advantage I claim of direct money financing versus debt financing is, first of all, of course, debt and financing cost would dramatically reduce. We would not have a current debt of 2.6 trillion in the UK and a financing cost in excess of 100 billion a year, because we would have redefined debt into direct money financing. Secondly, we therefore avoid austerity because it's the debt argument that is being used all the time to reduce welfare expenditure and other forms of government expenditure and impose austerity. We would be running the economy at full employment of real resources, whereas the present paradigm risks running the economy at less than full employment of real resources. And the claim I would make is that if this historic debt we've accumulated had been funded by direct money financing, it would not have had any inflationary effect. So the 2.6 trillion debt we currently face is, of course, the accumulation over many years of government expenditure on hospitals, roads, welfare benefits, schools, and so on. My claim is, if exactly the same expenditure had been made, no more, the same expenditure, but it had been funded by direct money financing rather than debt financing, there would have been no inflationary effect because it would have been simply the same expenditure. The difference would be that the pension funds and the insurance companies would have more funds because they wouldn't have lent them to the government, and therefore would be able to invest in other assets like UK equities rather than in bonds. And that would have indeed helped the pension funds to avoid the recent LDI crisis, where some of them very nearly went bankrupt. So moving on to the final bits of the book, that technology determines the economy. That seems to me to be a reasonably sustainable statement, because consumption depends upon a whole range of new products and services which technology is constantly designing and making available. Production of those goods and services is radically altered by automation and technology. It changes the capital labor ratio and raises productivity immensely. And we're all better off today because of that technologically increased productivity. Technology changes distribution because it shifts sales. Retail sales go online. We automate warehousing and logistics. It determines employment by the quantity of employment it requires and the type and skill level and the wage associated with it. It determines income by its level, its distribution across those household quintiles, and the composition between labour and non-labour income. And it determines market transactions and outcomes because of internet and information flows and transaction processing, ultimately, therefore, determining the standard of living by that productivity increase and a real price decrease, which further drives consumption. But for all those truths, mainstream economic theory basically excludes technology. So I try in the book, in association with others, to start to map out how technology interacts with the economy into a techno-economic process. And here I take 3 examples of weaving in the first 3 rows, car production in the next 6 rows, and then finally mobile phone technology. And in each one, in the right-hand boxes, their economic dynamic. I look at the R&D phase, the phase of capital investment, and the phase of capital deepening, where the capital employed is just expanded to increase output. So in the weaving case, we create an automated loom, which of course is R&D and increases GDP because it's economic activity. We deploy that automated loom, which in the first instance can be expected to reduce aggregate labour, employment and income. And then we expand cloth output by putting these looms everywhere, which can be expected to increase employment and labour share. So the question for all of these sectors is what the net effect is on labour, employment and income. And I would point out that whilst employment seems to hold up, it's income that doesn't hold up. And you get the phenomenon currently of in-work poverty, which by its definition shows that work is not sufficient as a means to adequate income. The question of whether technology is labour displacing and or labour augmenting is very thoroughly debated in the literature by David Autor and Darren Acemoglu in particular, and I cite that literature and work through it with comment in the book. And there does seem to be a shift occurring between Autor and Acemoglu, that 5 years ago, most of their papers were saying that technology is labor augmenting. Now they're coming to a view that actually it is labor displacing net. The critique of economic theory I presented in the book is that economic theory is, first of all, dominated by price theory, i.e., the claim of Marshallian economics, even in today's USA Economics 101 course, and also at Cambridge University's primer books, which I review in my book, is that price determines consumer demand. Now, I'm not saying price doesn't affect it, but the idea that price is the unique determinant is highly questionable, because consumer demand is determined by all sorts of factors, including pretty random ones. Depends which order you walk around the supermarket in, and which goods they've placed close to the till, and what adverts you saw on television last night. So, and what peer group effects, what your friend said that they enjoyed, and so on. And the same idea that wage as a price, the wage as the price of labor, determines employment demand. And in the General Depression, the 1930s, neoclassical economics, of course,
Is Geoff frozen at that point? Is everybody else there? Yeah, well, I can see people blinking away. Right. Let's see if Geoff gets back in again. Some fascinating thoughts coming out of that. Slightly concerned that we lost Geoff a minute. Yeah. Anybody got any thoughts about what he said so far? For me, it seems to me a little bit of a three-card trick going on with money.
Well, my thought, Ian, is that I'd like to see a lot of this stuff in a causal loop diagram format, so I can spot the links and then also overlay what the mitigations are that he's proposing. Lists don't help me much, I'm afraid.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it does seem extraordinarily complex business, doesn't it? Especially when you get into the sort of the way that money is passed around in huge amounts between Bank of England, government, and the financial institutions. Yeah. What can we do about it? I'm also thinking.
It's economic policy, monetary policy is so complicated. I felt like there was so much there that it needed to be unpicked a lot more and slowed down a bit, so that if you're not an economist, you'd struggle to understand some of what was being said there, in my view. You need to show it. If you're going to get out to a broader audience for more people to understand economics, which is crucial, I think that you need to define the terms a little bit more clearly at times.
I agree. I mean, Geoff has been working on this for the last 15 years, he told me earlier. And I think you need 15 years in order to sort of get to grips with all of the terminology and the ideas and the processes that are going on. Yeah.
I think Donnie wanted to come in.
Yeah, Donnie, you're thinking there. I can imagine what you're thinking. I hope.
Yeah, just building on what Hugh's saying here, and Richard, in terms of like accessibility, and taking that, I think that I imagine that we're all in a similar kind of interest around income inequality and addressing these kinds of things. So I feel like the sentiment is similar with what Geoff's sharing and what I feel, but my analysis is totally different. And to Hugh's point, I think a lot of people introducing these ideas around money, finance, etc., add in a lot of the complexity that make it almost inaccessible unless one is going slowly. Oh, here's Geoff back, so I'll pass back to Geoff and I'll pick up my comments when the time's right.
Thanks, Donny. Hi, Geoff. You're muted at the
You're on
moment.
mute.
Yeah, you're on mute, Geoff.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost you all then. Did you get the presentation or not?
Well, we got to slide 15 quite
Okay.
well, but the last bit, you suddenly disappeared, and
Okay,
so we've been chatting.
you've got enough to talk about. Yeah, sorry, I don't know how that happened. Wow.
Right.
Okay,
Yes,
I'm all ears.
all ears. Well, I think some of the comments just we were talking about then is the fact that you need your 15 years of working in this field to understand it. And is that something that you found common, that it is difficult to explain some of these ideas to people? And how would you sort of go about sort of trying to get us up to speed a little more in order to have more participation in the debates about what should be done?
No, I do agree. I mean, I think some of the ideas are complex and challenging, but that's again why I've written the book in the way I have done it, because the first chapter is largely graphical. In other words, there are lots of pictures and lots of graphs. And the aim of the first chapter is fairly simple, to show that income is inadequate for low quintile households. So I think that's an easily taken point. The second chapter becomes more complex on money, where I'm claiming that money is not quintessentially debt, and that the current practice of calling it debt is misguided, and that we need to redefine our understanding of money so as money is created, and move towards a point where we allow the government to create money to fund its own expenditure and not be forced to borrow it from pension funds and insurance companies who have received it through the system by commercial banks initially creating it. So the commercial banks are making huge profit out of this, and the government's being forced to borrow money and not being allowed to create it. So the second part of the book is really just saying governments should be allowed to fund their expenditure by simply creating the money for it. The third part of the book does get, again, more complex, because I'm then looking at the literature by people like David Autor and Dan Acemoglu to ask the question whether technology is labor displacing or labor augmenting. That's more complex, but I mean, by setting it out, I hope fairly thoroughly, it does require a more serious read through. The last chapter is even more complex and is really for nerds and economists.
We may get there one day, Geoff. Thank you, Richard. Before you go ahead, I just noticed in the chat that Angela's put something in here. It says, asks, why was it set up that commercial banks create money instead of the central bank? Is this due to the lack of trust of central banks or governments? I don't know, Angela, whether you want to say any more about that, but it is a sort of question that comes to my mind: is how did we get into this? How did we get to be as it is, as a problem? Angela, did you want to say anything? Maybe not. Geoff, what do you think?
She said no. Well, there is when you talk to the ECB, as I've recently been doing, or to the Bank of England, they do go quite stum. They go very quiet about it. They don't want to discuss it. And the claim they make is that direct money financing by the government is prohibited, which it is prohibited, because they're fearful of government profligacy. So they're worried that, a government's coming up to the next election, wants to release loads of sweeties into the economy and splurges out on expenditure, creates inflation and behaves irresponsibly. That's their claim. I mean, the counterclaim to that, of course, is, well, the same government has got the nuclear button. So if you trust the government with a nuclear button, why don't you trust them with money creation? And why do you trust stockbrokers and commercial banks, but not the government that you've elected? And if the government did behave in such an irresponsible fashion and create 50% inflation by releasing loads and loads of money, and they wouldn't get elected. So I don't buy this argument that the government is profligate and irresponsible. Therefore, it has to be made responsible by these other individuals who are hidden below the radar and raking in billions by doing it.
Right. Yeah. So, the obviously quality that is how do we shift things, but we'll come to that later. Maybe Richard, what have you got a question there? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Yes, Geoff, that was really interesting. And I was saying when you were somewhat offline, I would personally like to see kind of a causal relationship map arriving out of what you're describing, in terms of, this creates this, then this knocks onto this, either more or less. In other words, to create a dynamic relationship between all of these key factors, which I think would certainly help me understand the complexity of the process in which we find ourselves. And also on top of that, when you're then talking about the mitigations that would be necessary, it becomes then clear how the pernicious and pathological causalities that have resulted from our system might be, therefore, as it were, the vicious circles can be broken and then, as it were, developed out of the situation we're in. And just whilst I've got the mic for a second, I just posted in the LinkedIn thing something on a LinkedIn group on post-labor economics. And this is an interesting group because it's arisen out of folk who've been looking at AI particularly and saying this is disruptive in a way we've never, ever encountered. And therefore, this is the moment when a new kind of economics needs to be created, because the current one is gonna ram into the buffers pretty damn quickly.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Richard, and I agree. I mean, there is a page in my book, which you probably can't see from this, where I do try to set out a circular flow. It's on page 64 and 65. And I also do quote research that we've funded at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath, where we've been looking at the link between technology and reduced labor income. So, I mean, I would accept we only scratched the surface, but we are trying to, look at the empirical justification for the hypothesis that we're making. And I would claim, at the end of the day, that QE, for all its faults, and it has many, many terrible faults, for all its faults, it did demonstrate the validity of direct money financing. We did buy back government debt, and the government bought back its own debt by creating money. And a lot of the central bank, of course, at the Bank of England, they know this very well. And I have some good professional colleagues at the Bank of England. And that actually, on one occasion, about 3-4 years ago, I got invited into their internal seminar. And I said to them, well, thank you very much for this invitation, because, who am I? I'm a nobody. But secondly, please do give me a full critique. I'd rather you critique me than be polite. And they said, okay, well, we can do both. So I got to the end of the presentation and said, well, okay, thank you very much. What do you think? And they said, privately, Geoff, we agree with everything you said, but we cannot possibly say publicly because the Bank of England governor is worried it would spook the markets. So constantly we're faced with this psychological fear, which the Chancellor of the Exchequer also has, that anything we say that the markets don't like, if we spook them, they'll sell the pound and we'll be on our knees before the IMF again. So these psychologies are very powerful, unfortunately.
Yes, that's a huge area to work on. This psychological political connection is a very interesting one to work with. I've got Diana. You asked a question. Would you like to pose it, or shall I read it out?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I really found especially the bit where you were laying out everything about why the income of the lowest quintile is dropping in very real terms, and this increasing inequality. And you say, so we're going to need more social welfare spend rather than less, which I completely agree with. I'm wondering what that looks like to you. Do you think it's ever more, well, are you eligible for this and eligible for that? Or do you believe in a universal basic income approach? but also, often when I'm talking to people about, because I think UBI probably is not a long-term solution to everything, but a route on the way to something, to a different sort of economy. But I mean, anyway, that's another matter. But people are always very quick to point out all of the problems that are going to ensue from having this kind of universal basic income approach. In terms of everything from work ethic and getting anything done through to just the economy as a whole in terms of production and consumption and distribution of resources. I just wondered, what's your next step of saying, well, we're going to need some more social spend? What does that look like?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Diana. Very interesting and helpful comment. Well, my previous book was more specific in advocacy of basic incomes. My previous book's called Basic Income and Sovereign Money. And indeed, I launched and still maintain a website called The Case for Basic Income at www.ubi.org. So that's still up and running. The question, of course, is, should welfare benefits and non-labour income be distributed by targeted conditional benefits or by untargeted universal benefits? So it comes down to a debate between conditionality and universality. And the problems, I mean, conditionality seems to offer this targeted approach where you do get the money to the people who want it. So Martin Wolf at the Financial Times, who I correspond with quite a lot over the last 15 years, says to me, he said, why do you want to give me money, i.e. him, because he's reasonably well off. So we then get into the question, yes, but the alternative is conditional benefits. And the problems of conditionality are pretty well known, i.e. there means a system which is intrusive, which is humiliating, in which people don't apply, and therefore the take-up of benefits, particularly amongst elderly groups, is very low. But more importantly, that you get these unemployment traps and these poverty traps, because when people earn enough, if they do take work and they lose their conditional benefit, then it amounts to something like a 80 to 90% marginal rate of tax for them. So they're in an unemployment trap and then a poverty trap. So those are the critiques of conditionality, and my colleague Malcolm Torrey has written very extensively and very eloquently, I might say, about this. So the work we did at IPR Bath, we then shifted to saying, okay, here's the effect of a basic income, and the modelling work at Cambridge Econometrics demonstrated that a basic income of 100 billion total would work without inflation. But what if we reduced conditionality? So the IPR report, which again I quote in the book because I helped sponsor and define this, was in my view very useful. I think it's path-breaking really, because it shows, well, what happens if you take the asset test away, for example, on welfare benefits? What happens when you remove other elements of conditionality? How much does that cost? So I've shifted ground a bit myself to say, okay, if we can't get a UBI argued in the political process, we should at least be arguing for a shift towards universality by a decrease in conditionality. Yeah, that's the step I see. Not necessarily to go for lower numbers, but to go for a reduction in conditionality, which by definition increases the aspect of universality. The problem with UBI, and I've been an advocate for a very long time, is the opposition is huge. So, I mean, despite the fact that I have and many others have been talking to the likes of Martin Wolf, of Paul Johnson at the IFS, of Daniel Asimoglu, of various other major commentators, they've all in the last 2 years produced a major book within which there's 2 pages trashing basic income. And I've gone back to them each time and said, this is very unfair of you, because you know very well that your trashing of basic income is not addressing the arguments that have been made to you. You're just saying, okay, UK's got 53 million adults times £20,000 a year comes to some impossible number. So rubbish, it doesn't work, forget about it. You know very well that that's not a proper intellectual argument, but nevertheless, they get away with it. And at the same time, the UBI movement has been, in my view, unfortunately rather fragmented, doesn't pull well together, and certainly doesn't credibly debate with the likes of the people that I've just described. So it's kind of a complete standoff. So that's why I've tried in this last book to reframe the argument. So I do argue in the book for a basic income, but for a low basic income, but mainly to get there through a reduction in conditionality.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you, Geoff. I will get Donny to come in because he's had his hand up metaphorically. So, Donny, away you go. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Geoff, for such an interesting presentation. I really appreciate the point you raised about the top quintile getting more from investment income than the bottom quintile from labor income. And I want to circle back to that in a second. And I appreciate the invitation to really come back with some robust response. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to claim that there's been some sleight of hands that have been presented here, not intentionally, of course, but something that I see, having also worked in this field for 15 years. And I want to elaborate by way of a small example. So you mentioned the £4 billion that the brokers gain from central bank financing of purchasing in the secondary market of UK government bonds. Now, to the average audience listening to this, I can imagine that sounds like a big amount. But when you compare it to AstraZeneca, for example's net profit last year, which was £7 billion, it's actually not that big an amount. And what I think it does is it creates this emphasis that I hear you making that there's a problematic relationship here between the way the central bank purchases that you're saying would be better served by direct money financing. But in doing so, it sets up for us, the listener, a sense that it's actually a massive amount, and it minimizes the realities of what happens in terms of extraction in capitalist systems. The vast majority of money, that quintile piece you mentioned, isn't being caused by central bank purchasing bonds on the secondary market. It's being caused by capitalism, period. And so in that point, coming back to this notion of complexity and how to understand these ideas and looking at finance, money, debt over the last 15 years, to me, there is one simplicity we can come back to. And you mentioned it a little bit with the political hypotheses around rentier, the rentier class, etc. And that is, in any capitalist system, money is going to accumulate in the bank accounts of the richest households and companies. Now, we know that if money accumulates somewhere, because money enters the system and has an equivalent debt, right? When we take out a loan, we have to have an equivalent debt. It's not just money that banks create, they create equivalent debts. Therefore, if the money is accumulating in the household and company bank accounts more and more and more over time, debt has to be somewhere else. Direct money financing doesn't address that. UBI doesn't address that. Changes in technology policy can't address that. The only way you can address that is if you seek to move beyond capitalism. It doesn't matter what form of capitalism you have. So that's my main claim here, is that the idea about direct monetary financing doesn't address capitalist accumulation.
No, I take your point, and I'm as unhappy as you are with the inequality of both income and wealth in the capitalist system. You made the point that there is an equivalent debt to commercial bank creating the money. I mean, it's true that the commercial bank creates the money and then creates a debt because it lends that money, but it hasn't itself borrowed the money. It has created it. So, my fundamental point that since all money is created, ontologically, money is not debt. Now, I thoroughly disagree with Randall Wray about this. In much of what you've been saying, it's fairly in line with what the MMT school of thought says, and I've got a lot of respect for them. But Randall insists that money is debt. I take it, as you've heard from me, I take an opposite view, that it is not ontologically, fundamentally, quintessentially debt. It gets defined as debt because of the particular paradigm we're operating with. In terms of capitalism per se, I mean, this is, a long argument which Keynes had with Marxist views, that the Marxist view wanted to see the overthrow of rentier capitalism, and Keynes wanted to see the reform of rentier capitalism by having wage increases rather than wage reductions. And I mean, I worked in the post-Soviet economy for 16 years, and I was in 47 cities across the Russian territory. And in all those cities, I saw the result of the planned economy. And frankly, it was deplorable. It was an extremely sad outcome. So I don't mind being criticized for this, but I'm roughly in the Keynesian mold, that I want to see significant reform of the capitalist system of free enterprise rather than its replacement by a planned economy run by bureaucrats, which I think is open to another kind of exploitation. But I accept those different political views. I mean, my colleague in basic income, Guy Standing, Guy is much more oriented towards a Marxist position. And whilst I have a lot of respect for the Marxist diagnostic, I'm not quite in the same place politically as Guy is, but we're very good friends and have lunch together quite often. And the same with the MMT school of thought. In some places, MMT is quite resistant to debate, but in other people, like with Stephanie Kelton, for example, you can have a useful conversation. MMT believes in job guarantees. I'd love to believe in job guarantees, but I think the technology is making job guarantee impossible. But it's the monetary reform definitely has to be debated. And my plea to the MMT community is, please, let's be inclusive about the debate, because there are central bankers I know who deliberately said to me they won't engage with MMT because it is so single-minded. There's not room for the central bank to then come back with its position and discuss it. But I accept your point. I mean, we're both equally critical of the capitalist result, but you're more critical of the system per se than I am. I still hope and believe that it can be reformed.
There's a lot to debate there, Geoff, I feel. Zach, you have your hand up. Anything you'd like to say now? Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Hey Geoff, thank you very much for the presentation. I just wanted to maybe pick up on a little bit early in terms of the sort of psychological aspects of this. And obviously, it's been quite a long time since money has had any sort of base in material reality, being connected to the gold or whatever, some sort of physical thing. And then you were sort of talking about how if any of these central banks or sort of powerful actors within the system did come out with an actual critique, that could kind of like spook the markets. And there was this kind of like, yeah, we agree, but we're not allowed to publicly agree kind of thing. And it made me think a lot about kind of game theory and this idea of like whoever sort of makes the move first to sort of make some leap to the next system is at some sort of strategic disadvantage. But that's obviously from a place of business as usual and stability. Whereas on the back of some form of systems collapse, actually, maybe every single government would do it within a year. So I would just wonder what your thoughts were around the kind of the psychology of business as usual, and yeah, kind of maybe the ambition to kind of try something that is actually different, like fundamentally, not incrementally.
No, well, thanks for that, Zach. I mean, yeah, that's a very good comment. You know, as I said earlier, changing orthodox opinion is extremely difficult because they all interlock with each other, and everybody's afraid to put their head above the parapet. So I think Max Planck, the German scientist, said that scientific theory changes one funeral at a time. People rarely change their minds, and they have invested their whole career in the present paradigm, and they believe in it. as another friend of mine says, well, Geoff, these people learnt this at the university, including at some of our best universities, and they're not prepared to rethink it. So people cling to, and you'll see from Mervyn King to John Kay and so on. I mean, they are very determined to preserve their position because they think it's reputational for them, and it is reputational for them. There's no doubt about that. So they cling on. But I mean, I do agree with you. This question of tipping points, in social psychology, and I did think that however faulted QE is, it was a gift horse to us because it did do exactly that. I mean, it did change debt into direct money financing, and it showed actually it was stable. So, relatively speaking, the system hasn't totally collapsed. I mean, we've got some inflation coming from China shutdown and Ukraine war and COVID and so on and so forth. But the system hasn't totally collapsed, despite the fact that 40% of UK government debt was bought back. So COVID, of course, awful as it was as a pandemic, and the QE that went alongside it was a gift. What's a gift horse in the one horse expression? Was a gift to alternative thinking. But that's why they're entering into QT as fast as possible to try to undo the demonstration that their orthodoxy is misfounded. And you can get central bankers, as I say, and I've had to agree not to name some of my sources because a central bank senior central bank economist has reviewed my book helpfully for me because I'm not an insider, to check out whether I have missed something. And the result of that has been a couple of adjustments, but basically it's a view that this central bank senior economist endorses, but has said to me, you must not quote me in public. Well, I mean, how devastating a critique of their position is it that the critique of their position can't be stated in public? It's completely anti-intellectual.
But I mean, there you're stating that this is a gift and it's kind of a sort of natural experiment that's kind of been unraveling around us.
Yeah.
But there's no way that you can understand what the alternative would be if QE wasn't created, and maybe we would have dipped in some massive deflationary spiral, and it would have crippled the European economy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, maybe actually they would have had to look to other ways to address the problem, and maybe they would have looked to address inequality instead. Whereas within the period of quantitative easing, like that's what the largest increases in inequality that have ever been observed in the modern world. So I think in isolation, it's interesting and as an intellectual experiment to see that it doesn't completely destabilize the system, but it also hasn't really addressed any of the issues that you've identified, right? At this point.
No, you're right. I mean, we've come out of it, and Rachel Reeves is spouting orthodoxy and saying that we need to reduce welfare benefits to low-income people because we can't afford them. Well, as Keynes said, if we're doing it, we can clearly afford it because that defines affordability, the fact that we're doing it. But then she's worried about the debt, but that's because the debt is incorrectly defined. It's very, very difficult to raise this argument. The one other person who I think has done very well is Adair Turner. So if you look back at some of Adair Turner's papers, which are cited in the book, he has an IMF paper, I think it's 2015, in which he explores the practical feasibility of direct money financing. And he shows that it is totally practical. It's just a political question. So he compromises by saying it can be used on the margin occasionally. And I mean, I've had discussions with Adair, and I said, well, I agree with that, but I more than agree with it because I think it could be used fundamentally. I see no argument against its fundamental use. And he said, well, yeah, okay, Geoff, then I agree with you. So, but he's again been shunted off. He's gone into more environmental issues at the moment. He then gets shunted aside, despite the fact that he had significant public office, which I've never had. He had significant public office. He's shunted aside. The same as Paul Tucker, who is ex-deputy governor of the Bank of England, now at Harvard, saying the reserves created by the central bank at the commercial banks to buy the bonds backing QE, those reserves should be tiered and not all have interest paid on them. A very eloquent paper by him, 2022, I think it is, quoted in my book again. And who was it? I think it was IFS. that published his paper. But again, Paul Tucker's sidelined, and people go on talking as though neither Adair Turner nor Paul Tucker have had anything to say. They just ignore it.
So what was Turner's first name?
Adair, Adair. He's a lord in the Lord Turner, Lord Adair Turner.
Great. Thank you.
2050. It's quoted in the book if you do get around to buying it. I don't make any money out of selling the book, by the way, so I have no commercial interest.
Nobody ever does.
I know some of my other author friends, they're having to pay the publisher to publish their book.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Zach, for that. Diana, you mentioned a word which has been on my mind quite a bit in your comment in the chat about the fact that we have a hugely complex system with many lock-ins and path dependencies that make it very difficult to shift, and many what I call pernicious patterns of reinforcement actually happening. And success to the success was one of the main ones of that. And it's all built into a system that has growth as its sort of objective in many ways. How does this all translate into a world where degrowth is what we're after? And how could a system work in that concept of reduction of that, and a sort of a very different world to looking at GDP growth all the time? Has this really been an area that you've looked at, Geoff?
Yeah, and only vaguely, because I'd claim that the paradigm I'm advancing is applicable to any level of GDP, but where that GDP is substantially produced by technological automation. So I'm fingering technology as the culprit, but I think, my colleague in Basic Income, Philip van Parijs, Philippe, is a professor in Belgium, and one of the great advocates of basic income, and he is very much in favor of degrowth. So I don't think that the basic income argument is in any way contradictory to a degrowth argument. Whatever level of GDP we decide to have, whatever level of consumption we decide to have, whatever standard of living we decide to have, the real point is whether we produce that by technological automation, which requires less labor.
Diana's point is that this could be a route to degrowth. Diana, I don't know whether you want to say any more about that.
Yeah, the problem is, and I've been involved with some other organizations like WeAll, and they're trying to make the economy more fair. And one of their things is, and this is where I kind of fall apart with them, is like, oh, well, what we need is, better jobs for everyone, better income protection for the lower workers, if you like, or lower skilled work, and more and better jobs for everyone. But more and better jobs for everyone means more production and more waste and more everything else. And the problem with GDP is it's the production of the thing that counts. And actually me mending and maintaining things at home, which from a Earth perspective is valuable, from a GDP perspective is not valued at all. And so I think that the reason I think that that universal basic income is a necessary step towards degrowth is it's a way of saying, no, we don't have to rely on jobs, that, we don't have to make more and more jobs. What we need to do is give people spare time so that they can do things like mend their own clothes and cook from scratch and not have to, buy the latest gadget. And it's part of that.
Yeah.
That route, therefore. I think it's a complex thing. And my personal view is far more extreme than Donny's in terms of getting rid of capitalism. But I do see UBI as, a step along the way.
No, I entirely agree with all you just said. I do think UBI is a fundamentally ecologically sound policy, because as long as you rely upon employment to generate people's income, then, as you say, you will get ever increasing production. So I agree entirely, and that argument's made on the website ubi.org. So we have common cause there.
Can I just?
Simon, yeah.
Can I come in?
I was just saying thank you.
Hi, Geoff. A non-economist's question for you. We're forever being told that productivity in this country is really bad because we don't invest in technology sufficiently. And so I'm wondering if technology investment had been at levels that people say it should be, whether the levels of inequality would be still greater than they are now, or do you have other factors that you would assign to the levels of inequality that we see at the moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, thanks. That's very well put, and I referred to my opening statement that I don't pretend to have the answer to every question, but I'm not. It's a very good question. What is the connection between productivity and inequality? So you can go for high levels of productivity. What will that do to inequality? And the fear I have is that investment in high technology production to increase our productivity is inevitably going to emphasize the present employment pattern, which requires far more high-skilled labor. Therefore, people at the top of the income scale are in demand and getting paid more and more, and require less of low-skilled labor. So that's my worry. I mean, look at London Underground ticketing offices; they've all gone because automation has replaced them. So, but the people who write the system, there is a demand for people to write those kinds of systems, but there's no longer any demand for the people to staff the ticketing offices. So I think productivity, whilst highly desirable, and I would argue in favor of productivity, but matched by increased welfare income, because I think that productivity might knock labour income even further. I mean, in terms of why UK productivity is low, I mean, I do think the industrial dynamic in the UK is inferior to that of other economies. And I worked for most of my career as a strategic consultant in industry. So, I was watching what the French, the Germans, and the Italians, the Japanese, and everybody else is doing compared to what the UK is doing. And whilst the UK has got some extremely good examples, like Renishaw, for example, close to where I live, or Dyson, or whatever, there are some good examples of high productivity, good development. They're very limited. And in the major industries like power generation, we just dropped all our power generation capability in the UK. We can no longer build a power station. We dropped our railway manufacturing. We buy Hitachi trains and so on. So, I mean, we have lost productivity. And the other argument to make in the book, which is pretty controversial, is that, in my view, increasing the pension age tends to have an effect to reduce productivity because you get then a cohort of people in their mid-60s or late 60s who stay on in the company without that increasing the company's productivity. So I started my career at Rolls-Royce Aero Engines up the road from where I live now in Bristol. And my view is that people retiring from Rolls-Royce at 68 rather than 65 does not add to the productivity of aero engines. There's a Norwegian study that I quote in the book, actually, where people are beginning to think about this. Is increased retirement age partially responsible for reduced productivity? I think it possibly is. That's a pretty controversial view.
Anybody else want to say anything directly? And Angela, Hugh, yep.
Yeah.
Where you go, Hugh? Sorry.
Thank you, Geoff, for that presentation. A lot of complexity, but I'm a political scientist by background, and I think it's really crucial that more and more people understand economics, the economic system. Just in relation to universal basic income, which people are arguing is a positive, good idea, I think you've alluded to it. The problem is it's difficult to sell that politically, isn't it? Very difficult to sell that politically.
Very, yeah.
But the other slightly different thing for me here, I would argue that one of the basic premises of a good economic policy is to create happiness and well-being. And one of the areas of policy which people talk about but needs to be developed much, much more is support for early years, isn't it? Early years education, support for young children. Because if children have damaging experiences in the first couple of years of their lives, it's often very, very hard to recover from that. So economic support in the early years for young children, I think, would increase happiness, well-being, and would also increase support with, strengthen the economy. But just one other point, you made a point earlier on that why can't we trust governments to be involved in direct monetary financing when we trust governments to have their finger on the nuclear button? I guess the argument is there are lots of other people with their finger on the nuclear button, which acts as a constraint. And maybe the financial markets are the nuclear button in terms of things like direct monetary financing.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree with all of that. But on the other hand, you see, if we give in to a theory of irresponsible government, we just shrug our shoulders and say we've got to put up with irresponsible government, I think that's rather giving in. So I think we need a social dynamic that somehow or other insists on responsible government. And to some degree, we have responsible government. I don't think any of us would claim that even the present UK government is in every way irresponsible. There are some responsibilities that are taken on and fulfilled. So, but this is always the claim of the financial markets. Our governments will be profligate and they need us, the bond markets, who are very sensible and acting in the public interest, are they? Heck. But, it's a good debate.
Thank you there. Angela's comment mentions the idea of using taxation policy as an instrument somehow in this. She actually mentions that people have talked about needing to introduce a tax on robots. How does this fit into what you're suggesting for direct money methods?
Yeah, well, there are those proposals out. I'm aware of them, but I've never worked them through in any model. So, how a robot tax would work, I would be talking off the top of my head, frankly, because I haven't worked it through. I think, wealth taxes are another thing that people raised quite often. But the problem with a wealth tax is, first of all, wealth is a stock and tax is a flow. So how are you going to change the stock into a flow? We're going to sell off all these assets to pay a wealth tax, or can wealth be paid in wealth? In other words, you hand over some PLC shares, or you hand over a factory or two, or whatever it may be, or you hand over a car or three. Secondly, that point that wealth is in so many diverse assets, as Johnny Reynolds, I think, made the point the other day. It's going to be very difficult to value everybody's assets if it's in fine art or it's in bottles of wine stuffed in the earth somewhere. So I think a wealth tax, whilst it has a very attractive concept, is actually really difficult to administer, which is why most jurisdictions have actually dropped them. But the other point about tax, of course, is that you would then be reducing expenditure, reducing demand in the economy. And that may fit well with a degrowth strategy, as long as you protected the poor whose incomes were hit.
Yes. These are complex systems, aren't they?
Yeah, you'd have to do a thorough modelling like Cambridge Econometrics model to see what the impact would be on, in this case, low quintile incomes. And there are some versions of basic income, actually, which actually increase child poverty. So it depends how you set the parameters and model it through to make sure that you don't create adverse effects.
Thank you, Geoff. Would anybody else like to make a comment here? There are some in the chat, Diana in particular there. I don't know whether we can read those later if you like. I think it makes some extremely interesting points there about technology and inequality, and sort of the governance systems we have. There's obviously a huge amount to keep thinking about, Geoff. You've sort of set off a rather large number of trains and threads of thought here that I think we could spend quite a long time developing all of these and thinking about them. One thought comes to mind. Have you thought about how E.F. Schumacher might have approached some of these issues?
I'm relying on you for that, Ian.
I wonder
was hoping you were going to tell me.
I mean, he was very keen on the concept of good work and the fact that work was a necessary part of being a human, basically. Now, how that fits into the sort of present day economic systems we have, I think is something that we need to continue to work with, literally, to sort of find out what he really meant by that in today's world with the technology we see coming at us at a high rate. Because I think there's a huge danger that we might be away from his vision of what work might be for people. And the fact that we might all be isolated and alienated from our economic systems, the way things are going, is something to work on.
No, I do agree with that. I mean, there is therefore the human philosophy and almost a human ontology raised by the question of moving towards less work. So I had a thought experiment in my previous book of considering an economy which is totally automated. So you plug it, it's a thought experiment. You plug a machine into the earth, and it produces all the goods and services that we want without any labor. Now, in that situation, the product, the goods and services, would have to be allocated by voucher. So everybody got given a voucher, which is equivalent to a basic income. And also in that picture, the government would be totally funded by direct money financing. So it's true, of course, that you then say, well, what is the redefined understanding of what it is to be a human being if you have less work or even if you have no work? Now, not everybody works, of course. Children of a certain age don't work. The retired people don't work. So it's perfectly possible to be a human being without working. So the question I put back to probably redefine Schumacher a bit is to say that it's fundamental to a human being to have the opportunity to be creative. And in what way would you be creative? So my friends who've retired, they are doing some very creative things. I mean, one of them's down at the sailing club teaching young people to sail. Another's gone into photography and is really enjoying creative photography and so on. And not one single one of them wants to go back to work. And I make the comment that when I started my working career, age 17 at Rolls-Royce Aero Engines, I was talking about earlier, at 4 p.m. when the factory bell went, people weren't hanging around thinking, I'll just stay another couple of hours. They were at the factory gate, dashing for their cars. So, I mean, we have to get real about this. How much work, of course, is creative. But the 9 to 5 office straitjacket and the 8 to 4 factory floor straitjacket are not necessarily enabling human liberty, freedom, and flourishing. So I agree that people, but certainly we need creativity, and how we would redefine it as we do less work. But we've been doing less work for the last 100 years. People were working 100 hours a week, and now they're working 35 hours a week, and it may be 28 hours a week, and it may get to Keynes's 15 hours, which in this essay for Future for Our Grandchildren, it may get down to this 15 hours. And then we've got to say, right, who am I? What is it fundamentally to be me? I'm no longer at this lathe in the factory. I'm no longer at this desk in the office. I'm no longer at this blaster laptop covered with all these keys all the time. I'm no longer on internet chats. Who am I? What am I? So this is a big philosophical question. And in the institute at Bath, I have suggested that there should be a strand on exactly that point you made to redefine human ontology.
Right. I totally agree with you. It's just interesting being retired, never ever so busy.
Yeah.
and but luckily living off some kind of income. I'm not quite sure where it's come from,
Well, there we
but
go.
one gets by. Almost as if it's a uniform basic income being paid
It
to
is.
people who retire. It is, and so we should be looking to reduce the retirement age rather than
Yeah.
increase.
Agreed.
Yep,
I think
superb.
so. It's a massive
Yeah,
con on people who've lived for 60 years expecting to be able to retire and then told that they can't. Yeah.
exactly. Richard,
Yeah,
you comment.
I don't know if you've ever watched science fiction, but buried within the genre known as the Star Trek series, there is embedded, but never really explicitly explored, something which is now being known as Trekonomics. In other words, you go forward to an era where you've got all sorts of resource fulfilling activities. So you're not actually driven by money. You're driven by other things, which is to do exactly with what you were saying there, Geoff, the flourishing aspect, the nature of what it is to be human. And I think that is incredibly important perspective to take to move forward for a few decades. And I think it's only going to be a few decades before all these changes are going to kick in for
Yeah.
good or ill. And I suspect there's some really rich sources of inspiration from those sort of deep and considered science fiction type perspectives,
Yeah.
which would be as well to fold into what you're suggesting for that Bath University Institute you're talking about.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful, Richard. I agree.
Great. Well, Geoff, thank you very much. My last thought was that we ought to take your book and anything else you recommend, and feed it into AI, Chat GPT or whatever, and ask it to come up with what is the best path forward for us to take. How do we do it? So maybe that's a little exercise we could do one day.
So you're going to automate me and displace me, huh?
Yes. Well, you can then retire into whatever wonderful pastime you take. So,
Great.
thank you very much indeed,
And thank you
and
for your invitation.
highly recommend your book. And hopefully, we see you again soon and take part in what we're doing. And particularly as you are Bristol based, you're very welcome to call in anytime at all and
Thank you.
continue with this discussion. So, on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much indeed, Geoff. That was brilliant. Thank
No,
you.
thank you for the invitation and for your interest and for the feedback. It was a good discussion. Thank you.
Great.
All the best, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye.
See you again soon. Bye. Thanks, Geoff. That was great. Yeah. We had a good set of people there, I think. On. And